Our last segment is titled Gen Zs Aren't Committed to Being Committed. And I wanted to touch on this because I myself am in Generation Z. And so I thought maybe there is a unique perspective to be had there. But basically, what it's saying is that we Gen Zers have a very different kind of perspective on love and sex and dating, as far as marriage and kind of what we're looking for in a partner and when we're ready to quote settle down. And so it just kind of goes over a lot of different comparisons between Generation Z and the other generations such as millennials or Gen Xers. And so yeah, that's that's pretty much the gist of it. So what do you all think before I give my 2 cents?
I'm generation old, so
Oh gosh.
it's not a surprise to me really that different cultures and different generations have different attitudes towards sex. I've got different attitude than my parents had. They've got different attitudes to their parents had, and my children will grow up with different attitudes than I have. I think it's going in the right direction. It's moving to a more healthy way. One thing that did strike me about this was that it seemed to be largely a personal opinion rather than
Mhm.
research so much. So although I did agree with a lot of what the article said, the thing for me is I'd really like to see research which would add to what was said in the article. It would get
Absolutely.
some peer reviewed research behind it, get that stuff out there, and let's have an academic conversation about it.
I feel like you read my notes because I put in there one important thing to note is that much of the article is anecdotal and opinion. So I think it's kind of funny that you touched on that. And that's not to say that it's not true or that there aren't trends, but I agree a lot with what August had to say and what Richard had to say, but I didn't really agree too much with the article itself in terms of this being just a Gen Z trend. And I'll explain more what I mean about that, but, um, what I'm seeing is general trends in multiple generations moving away from traditional relationship models and really challenging them and thinking about them. So I see not just in terms of marriage being challenged, with, "Hey, marriage is a institution that's not really working very well, so, me and my long-term partner, we're not gonna do that." But I also see a change away from just monogamous relationships to it being more open to talking about different relationship models in general, whether it's serial monogamy or polyamory, or just opening up a monogamous relationship to be an open marriage. There's a lot of different relationship models now that are being more openly discussed without like so many taboo labels being attached to them. So I really do see this as more of a cultural trend. But August brought up a good point earlier that I think could explain the Gen Z thing. And when it was back during the talk about the Catholic Church and how when you're raised in something that's normal, it just becomes normal. So those young people who are raised with like, "Oh, gay marriage is okay," they adopt it because it's normal for them. It's what they're used to. It's what they grew up with. And I think a lot of Gen Zers were seeing this sort of transition and these struggles that our generations were sort of wrestling with. And they're embracing like the hey, you know what? That is a problem and I'm gonna think about it. Which I think is a good thing. So while I don't necessarily think the article is wrong, I just think they sort of miss a broader cultural perspective that could be sort of that this conversation needs to be enveloped in.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So one thing I think Laura kind of touched on that I wanted to kind of extrapolate on was the fact that, they're putting I think the article puts a lot of emphasis on the word marriage and kind of what that means. And I think some people look at like, oh, well, Gen Z doesn't want to get married, or at the very least, they're waiting to get married, as like, we don't want to have just one long term partner. But very anecdotal, but I am in old Gen Zer, and me, and a lot of people I know, and just the people in their 20s and maybe late teens, we are still in long-term committed relationships that are very stereotypical, socially acceptable kind of monogamy. So just because we aren't making it a government thing, does not mean we don't commit to people, and it doesn't mean that we don't want long-term companionship. So I wanted to make it clear that, like, even though we are maybe waiting to get married or choosing not to get married, that does not mean we don't want monogamy. And so I want people to get that misconception out of their head. I know I personally am very wishy-washy on it, and I'm in my early 20s, and I just can't even imagine, even though I myself am in a long-term committed monogamous relationship, I cannot imagine, doing that kind of thing right now. And not only marriage, but there's so much about, in the headlines, I think, about, the birth rate is dropping, and not just with Gen Z, but also with, millennials. And it's like, okay, but why is that like a super bad thing? I really am not finding a very compelling reason for why that would be negative, especially with all of these circumstantial stuff that is happening in our world right now, climate change and unrest and war and all these kind of things. I mean, I feel like it makes sense to at least wait. And I think it mentioned financials in there as well. And so there's just so many points to touch on. And again, it's very anecdotal. But I think, I don't think it should be viewed as a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the. I agree with both of you, and I think that's one of the things that, like I said, that I found with the article and that Laura apparently did as well, was that it was from a very kind of anecdotal um, perspective. Uh, I'm married to one person in a monogamous relationship. I've no intention of doing anything outside of that. I'm very happy with the way I've been married a very long time. By the same token, I do see a lot. I don't know what it's like in the States or in other countries, but in Britain, I see a lot of people who are older than me, uh, 15, 20, 25 years older than me, who who are married, who are opening that up to allow other partners in. Various different. I'm going to say combos, and that sounded a little bit more crude than I intended it. To different ways of thinking about marriage and not having it as a monogamous thing. And that's, I think people are touching on what Laura said. It's not just one generation that's doing it. I think a lot of people are kind of looking at things in a more it's more of a cultural thing. Now it's becoming part of the culture for all people. And that's the joy of it. That's what I found really good about the article, is that people can do things. We're in a stage now, we're moving forward. And if you want to be in a monogamous relationship, you can be. If you want to be in an open relationship, you can be. If you don't want to have a relationship and you just want as many sexual partners as you want, you can. And without like stigma being attached to it so much. And that's something that we never had in the past. We just didn't. You got married, and if you were lucky, you were happy. And if you weren't, you got divorced or you lived in an unhappy marriage. And with one partner, and that was the case for a long time. We are moving in the right direction. Laura's muted.
Oh, sorry about that. I have a cat in the room and I wanted to avoid the meowing. But one thing I wanted to point out was that the term, or the use of the term, pragmatic, right? And that's something I'm actually kind of curious about. I don't have necessarily an opinion on it, but it caught my attention. So are the Gen Zers all necessarily pragmatic in the sense that they are very, very thoughtful and they're thinking about it and they're weighing their options? Or is it in some cases that, there's sort of that rebellion against what they see as a broken system, or that they're seeing things fail so much for other people? Like, so what, to me, what does it mean when the author says pragmatic? Has she done the research to determine that these people are making informed decisions, or are people making emotional decisions, or is it kind of a mix of both? Like, certainly when I listen to August talk, I would say that's a very informed decision, right? I would say she's thought about it and she's making like good healthy judgments in terms of partnership. But it's kind of a broad spectrum to say that all Gen Zers are this or all Gen Zers are that. So I was just very curious and was wondering what your guys' thoughts were when you hear terms like that. Like, is there a lot of thoughtfulness going into this, or is it just a cultural trend? Or what are your guys' thoughts on the whys and the hows?
Um, so this is kind of tricky because it's so I think it's on like a very case by case basis. I think
Mhm.
at least again very anecdotal, but the people I've spoken to and myself, and even the article goes into it, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, we are reaching financial stability and emotional stability honestly kind of later, because of the unique struggles of our generation, I think, and every generation has unique struggles, but I think specifically ours are putting I don't know, more perspective into long term kind of things and not just, well, when you get in your 20s, you find someone and you settle down and you get married and you have kids, and there's all this stigma, 30-year-olds getting pregnant, which is totally fine. And then people are like, why did you wait so long? Like, it's just so I think part of my generation is thinking like, well, I'm not financially stable. I can barely afford an apartment, let alone a house. And how am I going to raise kids if I can't even support myself? And the people I speak to are all broke college kids, including myself. And we're just trying to survive. And how can we think about all of this, honestly, extra stuff about marriage and buying a house and having children when we can't even stand to live in our current, so I think some people are saying, hey, I don't want to bring a child into this. And especially, I'm not ready to. And also seeing, like they mentioned, the kind of failures of the other generations and kind of how having children and getting married has impacted them. And then I just think some people are kind of just, live for the moment. It's whatever, we'll just go with the flow, whatever happens, happens. And so they'll just kind of bounce around, which nothing wrong with that. It's just, so I really can't say yes, people are being thoughtful or no, people aren't being thoughtful. I think it's just such a combination of everything. I would like to think that majority of them are at least putting some kind of intelligent, taking the time to think about it. It's definitely stuff that's not it's something that needs to be thought through before carried out. But Richard, what did you think?
I think that this article to me, it mentions Gen Z, but what demographic of Gen Z? Because that covers, lots of, people in poverty will probably have different ideas to people who are from privileged backgrounds. It's. I think there needs to be more research done on it. I think
Mhm.
we really need to have a look at those. There's so much that comes into this. What are the ratio of, for example, teen pregnancies that are going off, and from what parts of the community they happening or almost prevalent in. All this extra research needs to be done to form a bigger picture, I think, and
Agreed.
and that was my major difficulty with this article. It just it just seemed to be kind of a blog post from a single person who was representing the whole of the generation with her own with ideas. And that was a big thing for me. I agreed with a lot of the stuff that was in it, and a lot of the stuff August touched on, about people being thoughtful and putting things back and waiting longer. I do see that as well in younger people. Younger people, like I'm 90. But by the same token, it has to be said that more research needs to be done to get a fuller picture. I think if investment is done, we get the research behind that, we get our heads in, we can have a really good conversation about Gen Z. But without that bigger picture, without those different analytics being done, then I think we are left with, this is my opinion, and this is my opinion, and this is my opinion, which is all very well and good, but it's not particularly informative.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that that's gonna be the note that we leave this on. Although I think there's a lot of good to be gleaned from this in terms of like, how cultures change and evolve over time. But I agree with you, and I think that that's a really good place to end it.